Rocket Riders of the 27th Century proudly brings to you a short story about a glimpse into the 31st century in Time and Tide. Written by Michael Moreau. Read for you by Mark Roddy. The well-lit and largely monotonously beige circular control room was quiet. Only the occasional sound of a cough, a sniffle, or the rustle of fabric as someone walked past broke the silence. When he'd first been assigned command, Zabit Redis had often thought about just how strange it felt to be in space and not have the constant hum of engines or the thrum of a reactor to keep one company. Neither were necessary in this place. The small base that served as the Forge's primary control facility was situated on the daylight side of a habitable, albeit tidally locked, little planetoid. The quark star that orbited tightly, Tybratus, had been harnessed to provide literally trillions of times more energy than any reactor, or even set of reactors, could ever manage. In fact, it was for this very reason that the Forge had been constructed in orbit around Tybratus. A soft interchange between two technicians on the far side of the room caused Commander Redis to momentarily look up from his scientific journal he'd loaded onto his datapad earlier in that morning. It wasn't just the lack of loud machinery that one had to get used to living on the base, but also the lack of loud people. In ordinary day-to-day life, even in military life, seldom could you find a group of sentients with more than 3 or 4 members that didn't contain at least one loudmouth. It was different here. The people that came to Flatrock, as they'd come to call the small planetoid, were not military or general populace. By and large, they were academics. Redis had often thought that the place reminded him more of a university campus than a military base. Despite being designated as an FWCS facility, the Forge outpost only had a handful of fleet personnel, with the vast majority of everyone else being either scientists or technicians. Despite the culture shock, however, the commander had decided some time back that he rather liked life on Flatrock. The entire habitable side of the planetoid was covered in what could only be described as one endless enormous meadow. It was filled with colorful and sweet-smelling flowers, devoid of trees or any significant topographical features, and inhabited by little more than the occasional inoffensive pollinating insect. The view out of the 360-degree window in the room in which they sat, at the top of the control tower, was quite unique. The flat terrain coupled with the relatively small diameter of Flatrock, only about 900 kilometers, meant that from their vantage point, Redis and the others could see clear to the gently rounded horizon, above which a thin blue sky tenuously clung to the tiny world. The commander tilted his head back and gazed at the quark star Tybratus through the heavily tinted skylight centered above his command chair. It loomed large overhead, appearing in the sky larger than both his hand and outstretched fingers would at arm's length. It gently pulsated with a soft purple glow, its surface broken by bands of pinkish-blue plasma that formed grand arcs as they danced above its surface. With quiet people, a quiet landscape, beautiful views, a top-notch facility, and not one but 2 Galaxy-class chefs, the little base on Flatrock left little to complain about. Bringing the steaming cup of Virgilian tea up to his lips a little too fast, the commander swore, "Great galactic serpent, that's hot!" He thought he heard a couple of the younger techs chuckle off to his right, but his attention was quickly brought to Lieutenant McCabe as she came running up with a nervous look on her face. "I am so sorry, sir," she exclaimed. "It's entirely my fault." Redis shook his head and pawed at his heavily grayed mustache and beard to wipe away any spilled tea. "It's quite all right, Lieutenant, I can assure you." The bright-eyed brunette had only taken over as his executive officer less than a week ago, and she was still very uncertain of herself. She was terribly smart and quite capable, but nonetheless the commander hoped that she'd get her bearings before too long. "What can I do?" she asked. Redis smiled. "My dear, you can start by relaxing a bit," he said as he handed her the saucer with a cup of tea. Her expression softened, but only a little. "No, wait," Redis remarked. "There is something you can do, Lieutenant." "Of course, sir," she snapped, anxiously awaiting the means to gain her superior officer's favor. "We know the precise temperature at which human flesh scalds, do we not?" McCabe was puzzled by the question. Of course that information was available in the database.
Yes, sir.
She shook her head.
Then do me a favor and program the space-blasted synthesizer to dispense hot beverages just a few degrees below that point, would you?
He chuckled, to which the lieutenant attempted her own slight laugh.
Thank Edna for hydrophobic fabric,
he said, pointing to where he'd spilled on his gray uniform jacket. The lieutenant managed a half-hearted grin before rushing off to do precisely as he'd asked. It had been a completely uneventful shift, staring at monitors and going through figures while the new hull, the JSP-X, went through inspection trials with her mostly automated crew as she orbited a few hundred kilometers over flat rock. Just then, the alert klaxon sounded. The commander jumped to his feet without giving it a thought. McCabe reversed course, set down the saucer on the closest flat surface, and then rushed over to her console. Her fingers danced over its surface as she manipulated the hologenic controls. "Report!" Redis shouted over the klaxon, which the lieutenant quickly silenced. The commander's eyes darted over the people in the tower. Most of them were civilians. He doubted that any of them had ever heard the klaxon sound before, despite being informed of its presence during emergency training drills.
"Perimeter sensor, sir," McCabe called out. "Something a bit shy of 1,000,000 tons just appeared at the edge of the system."
"Star drive," Redis mumbled to himself then, speaking to the lieutenant. "Sounds like a decent-sized ship just came out of Star Drive." She nodded in agreement. Just then he heard the doors at the rear of the room slide open as several fleet crew rushed in to relieve the civilians. Redis paid them no mind. "Is it transmitting in IFF?"
"Negative, sir."
"Of course not." The older man shook his head. "Do we have a drive signature?"
"Working,"
McCabe said as she toyed with the controls.
"Unable to obtain drive signature, sir. It looks like she's got her sublight powered down."
The commander looked over to the tall vertical status display on his left, saw Nathan Red Fox, the base's fleet engineer, standing where he'd taken up his station. "Mr. Red Fox, do your perimeter sensors have the resolution to pick out a silhouette at this range?" The surly engineer nodded. "Working." Redis watched him for a moment before raising his left hand to stroke at his beard while he waited. Those who'd known him back when he commanded the Bradley knew that the beard stroke meant he was feeling impatient. But he didn't think anyone on Flatrock, or the entire large Magellanic Cloud for that matter, had ever seen him do it. There had never been a need. "Display coming up," the engineer said plainly, tapping the keys that would transfer the image to the holographic projector in the center of the room. A moment later, the top of the beige cylinder that made up the projector machinery illuminated and a glowing wide-frame orb sprang into being just above its surface. The orb then transmuted into the currently two-dimensional shape of the unidentified vessel. Audible gasps filled the room, but the silhouette provoked only a thoughtful from the commander.
"Vrang heavy battlecruiser,"
Lieutenant McCabe called out. The shape, something akin to a two-chambered peanut shell with several rear-mounted spines which curved forward over the primary hull, was unmistakable. "Indeed," Redis said. He paused for a moment in thought, then allowed himself a wry grin before unceremoniously plopping back down into his chair. It seemed as though all eyes were on him as the command crew watched him get comfortable, apparently in no rush.
"Sir?"
an anxious Lieutenant McCabe asked after a moment. The commander raised a hand to stay her. The room was quiet for several more seconds until McCabe's console emitted a chime, indicating an incoming transmission. "Sir, incoming transmission from—" Red Fox began. He too was silenced with a finger. The engineer looked around the room. Everyone else seemed just as confused by the commander's demeanor. Finally, Redis spoke. "Lieutenant, can you patch me through to the JSPX?"
"Yes, sir, but what of the Vrang ship hail?"
"Lieutenant," he repeated calmly.
"The JSPX, please." "Aye, sir,"
she said, shaking her head in confusion, then quickly catching herself. Her fingers fluttered across the hologenic controls and the control tower speakers crackled to life. "Lieutenant Commander Reed here," said a voice on the other end. Then a second or two later, "Control, are you seeing what we're seeing out here?" "Yes, Lieutenant Commander. There is indeed hostile in forged space." Order, sir, Reed asked. Should we withdraw into the shadow of Flatrock? Redis could hear the hesitation in Reed's voice, and it pleased him to no end. Only if you think your hull isn't ready for combat trials, Mr. Reed. An audible scoff came through the speaker. As a matter of record, sir, I think a little demonstration is long overdue. Good, Redis grinned. That's what I was hoping to hear. Stand for your engagement orders. Acknowledge, Control. The commander signaled McCabe to terminate the transmission, then said, Vrang Hale on HoloLens. Yes, sir, the lieutenant acknowledged. Her left hand swung down over the hologenic surface of her console, and the image of the sensor silhouette was replaced with the scowling visage of a middle-aged Vrang. He looked rather perturbed. Redis saw the Vrang's eyes find him and appear to take stock of him. I'm Commander Zabit Redis, and you, Captain, are... Captain Klar, the intruder announced boastfully, of the Vrang Hierarchy battlecruiser Righteous Fury. Very well, Captain Klar, Redis sat forward and grinned. Not only are you trespassing in Federated Worlds space, but unfortunately also in a star system under direct coalition Starfleet authority. And then he hardened. Explain yourself at once. The Vrang shook his head. Oh no, Commander. It is you who will be explaining himself to me, Klar spat. This is a disputed system, and we are here to investigate some unfortunate rumors. What kind of rumors might those be? Redis asked snarkily. That the Federated Worlds is using this quark star to power some form of advanced weapon system development, in direct violation in the terms of the Treaty of... Do not speak to me of treaties, Redis roared and sprang to his feet. Lieutenant McCabe finally caught on to what the commander was doing. He was having fun with this. She glanced over at Red Fox and saw the amusement on his face as well. Under the treaty, Clark continued, of... Again, Redis cut him off. Since when have your ships ever respected our treaties, Captain? The Hierarch and the Council of Seven may accept your platitudes, Klar, but you and I know both very well out here in the clouds, Vrang ships do as they please. You raid our shipping, you threaten FW worlds, you undermine our lawful authority at every turn. The truth was that Redis knew he was only a few years from retirement. He might as well bring a little excitement to the boring beige room atop a boring little beige tower at the center of Flatrock Base. Klar sneered. Such hostility, Commander, he tutted. You have 30 seconds to clear our space, Klar. And with that, he casually returned to his seated position. Or what? The Vrang laughed. You have no warships. No, I think it is you who will stand down and turn over the contents of your memory banks, or we will... The commander raked his finger across his throat, signaling McCabe to cut the transmission. He pressed the button on the arm of his side chair to re-establish the audio channel with Reed. Commander, you have my explicit permission to engage the enemy. I am sending you the schematics of the Vrang Type 2 heavy battlecruiser. Please disable her weapons and sublight engines only. There was a brief moment of silence before Reed's voice came back over the line. Is this wise, sir? They won't be able to move off. Oh, won't they? Redis quipped. I seem to recall that ship of yours having some kind of gravity manipulation abilities. Or am I confusing it with something I read on the back of a box of Spacios? Reed felt like a fool for not having seen what the commander was getting at. Point taken, sir. But what of their fleet? Surely they'll return with more ships. Yes, I have no doubt that they will. But they will have to learn about our new capabilities at some point. Do you really think it will make any difference if that day is today? A decision for the higher-ups, though, no? Mr. Reed, us frightening the life out of a Vrang commander today may save the lives of FW citizens tomorrow. Something tells me that word will get out fast, and they'll put at least a temporary halt on their raiding. Still, sir, Redis waved his hand in the air, fully aware that Reed could not see the gesture. I'm authorizing it personally. Redis out. The JSPX was unlike anything the Federated Worlds, or anyone else for that matter, had ever constructed. She had no rivets, no welds, not even a single seam. She was molded, right down to her windows, from a single piece of the nigh magical material, transmodium. Transmodium was the closest thing to an indestructible material to have ever been discovered. Only through harnessing the energy of the exceptionally rare Quarkstar Tybratus to power its field manipulators could the forge work the material. Through rapid oscillation of gravity fields, they could superheat the material to over 500 million degrees Kelvin, at which point it would become pliable enough to mold into complex shapes. The JSPX, therefore, was, for all intents and purposes, considered impervious to any known weapons. For that matter, flying straight into the heart of a G-type star wouldn't even begin to test the limits of her durability. Lieutenant Commander Reed had been on the team that brought the technology from concept to completion, so it was his honor to see the ship into battle for the first time. The crew of the Vrang cruiser watched, stunned, as the innocuous little sphere on their sensors shot across the space between them in the blink of an eye, coming to a halt as quickly as it had accelerated. Then their shock turned into horror as the unintimidating little craft absorbed several volleys of fire with no damage, and then began to pick apart their own vessel with her gravity fields. Klar tried to order a retreat, but it was too late. As the righteous Fury turned to flee, her main engine assembly was torn free and tossed aside, as if by an angry invisible giant. The Vrang captain knew he had been bested. "Put him on," Redis said to McCabe. Despite this being their first actual meeting, the commander had seen the name Klar mentioned in enough reports over the years to think he knew the man, at least a little. He had felt certain that Klar would not force a fight to the death, especially one that he could not win. The hail had been welcome confirmation that his suspicion was correct. He had been wrong about one assumption, though. When the image of Klar reappeared on the holo, it was not anger that he saw in the man's face, but fear. He was right about one thing, though. No citizen of the Federated Worlds ever feared the Vrang again. The end.